Inside the brutal realities of the Spanish flu that killed 100 million people. Hey guys, welcome to our Evidencia Historica channel. Today we bring you another fascinating video, where you will be surprised by the reality of the facts of the Spanish flu. I'm sure you will be shocked by what happened throughout the most brutal pandemic in the world. History, but before we take this fascinating journey into history, subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss any intriguing and curious videos we post every week. Of all the horrors of the First World War, it wasn't bombs, bullets, or even mustard gas that ended up as the biggest killer. In fact, the act of moving so many people around the world turned out to be the deadliest fruit of the war. The final year of the war, 1918, saw the deadliest pandemic the world has ever known. With all those millions of soldiers being deployed around the world, the pandemic spread like wildfire. It was the Spanish flu pandemic. In terms of absolute death tolls, the Spanish flu beats the Black Death as the king of historical epidemics. The Spanish flu statistics are simply brutal, and the disease has reached every corner of the world. Survivors recount heartbreaking scenes of misery and quarantine, and today the flu ranks as one of the worst diseases in history, a reminder of how deadly the flu can truly be. The pandemic killed 5% of the world's population. It is estimated that they killed between 50 and 100 million people around the world between 1918 and 1919 alone. Just to give you an idea of proportion, the 4 years of the First World War killed only 17 million people in total. In the United States alone, more than 500,000 people were killed by the flu, 5 times as many Americans as died in the war. The flu infected, but did not necessarily kill, even more people. About a third of the world's population is believed to have been infected by some form of the Spanish flu. That's 500 million people at a time when there were only about 1.5 billion people on the entire planet. The disease targets young adults. The normal victims of the flu are typically babies and the very, very elderly. When a 50-year-old person dies from the flu, it's unusual. And a 25-year-old sportsman might think of the flu as a horrible week or two in bed, but the term life-threatening would never come to mind. The Spanish flu turned all of that upside down. Young, healthy guys would come home from work one day feeling a little sluggish, and the next morning they would be carried away in a body bag. This certainly scared a lot of people. Unlike normal flu viruses, the Spanish flu appears to target those between the ages of 20 and 35. The reason for this is that people born after 1889 were not exposed to anything similar to the 1918 strain of the virus. Those born before that date had some exposure to a similar flu strain, therefore, they had some immunity. This discovery only happened in 2014, so people at the time were left wondering why young men next door would simply drop dead while their little aunt was still going strong. The first recorded outbreak occurred in Kansas. Like college basketball champions and the world's corn supply, the Spanish flu appears to have come from unassuming Kansas. Although the state has many fine and comfortable establishments, Fort Riley was not one of them. In 1918, the army camp housed 26,000 men and was described as bone-chilling in winter and suffocating in summer. Oh yeah, and they burned tons of manure from the many horses and donkeys on the base, so it probably always smelled like the paper mill. On March 9, conditions at the base became much worse. The cook, Albert Gitchell, reported to the infirmary with a bad cold. By noon, there were more than 100 soldiers in the infirmary, apparently suffering from the same illness. In total, 1,127 soldiers contracted the flu, 46 of whom died. The condition spread to other fields, but once war was declared, the brass maintained tight control over information. Furthermore, an outbreak of disease among a band of men surrounded by less than ideal living conditions was not all that uncommon. The flu traveled to Europe with American soldiers. In March 1918, 84,000 American soldiers were sent to Europe. In April, another 118,000 crossed the lagoon. Together with them, the soldiers brought a chance of victory to the Allied powers. That, and also the deadly flu virus. Imagine you've been living in a muddy trench for the past 3 years, dodging artillery bullets and chasing the enemy. Somehow, you are still alive. Finally, some serious reinforcements are arriving and things are looking up. Then, out of nowhere, you get the worst flu you could imagine. Before you know it, you're lying in a cramped army cot next to a bunch of other flu victims, dying in a state of total delirium from your high fever. In the month of June, 31,000 cases of flu were reported in Britain. The virus spread quickly across enemy lines and beyond, into Russia, India and North Africa. By July, the disease had already spread across the Pacific, reaching China, Japan, the Philippines and New Zealand. Spain was the first country to announce the epidemic. Although Spain was not the first place to be hit by the disease, it was the first country to openly report it. That's because it was the first country that wasn't actively involved in World War I to experience the flu's incredibly high mortality rate. Where other countries, including the US, censored news for fear of harming public morale, Spain reported the outbreak freely, which is how the infamous flu got its name Spanish flu. Even remote villages were not immune to the disease. It wasn't just large population centers that suffered outbreaks of the Spanish flu. Even Inuit villages in Alaska have suffered outbreaks of the disease. In some cases, entire villages were completely wiped out by the disease. In other cases, all the adults were killed, leaving only the orphans to fend for themselves. One of these infected villages was the small Inuit town of Brevig Mission, Alaska. The disease claimed the lives of 90% of the city's Inuit population. It was so devastating that the Alaska Territory government had to pay gold miners to go up and bury the bodies. When the miners arrived, they dumped the bodies in a 2-meter-deep hole and covered it with permafrost. The second wave of the flu was much deadlier than the first. By the end of the summer, the first wave of flu was beginning to subside. People who weren't marked by the disease undoubtedly felt pretty good about themselves for having dodged that bullet. Then came the second wave of the pandemic. It all started at a naval installation in Boston in September 1918 and nearly destroyed everyone. Around the same time, the flu hit the port cities of Brest, France, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. It was at this point that the situation escalated from a standard pandemic to a crisis of apocalyptic proportions. In the month of October, 195,000 Americans died from the flu. The death rate during the second wave was 5 times higher than that of the first. The lucky ones who escaped the first wave were much more likely to catch the second wave and subsequently die from it. With infection and mortality rates so high, things quickly got out of control. Symptoms included bluing and internal bleeding. Getting the Spanish flu wasn't fun. The initial symptoms were similar to those of normal flu, fatigue, fever and headache, but they became more severe. When the coughing and sneezing started, things started to get really bad. People coughed so hard that their abdominal muscles tore. The flu was so virulent that it caused internal bleeding around the lungs. People bleed from the mouth, nose and sometimes the ears. People's skin turned really blue, to the point where it was difficult to identify their initial skin color. With all that damage to the lungs, pneumonia set in very quickly. People usually died within a day or two of first developing symptoms, sometimes within hours of discovering they were sick. They couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. The world's worst day is a mortician's best day, but the thriving casket industry simply couldn't keep up with the staggering death rate caused by the Spanish flu. We are talking about tens of thousands of people dying in a matter of a month or two and in almost every major city in the world. To prevent the infectious bodies slowly rotting in the morgue corridors from causing secondary infections, many places were restored to dig mass graves. In 2015, a mass grave was rediscovered in Pennsylvania. Located about 100 miles northwest of Philadelphia, the bodies were discovered after heavy rain washed away topsoil near a highway embankment. There were no coffins, just human bones protruding from the ground. If you like it, support our channel and drop your finger on like. The war created a shortage of doctors. Many of the doctors trained at the time of the Spanish flu had already joined the military to help with the war effort. Even before the United States entered the war, many doctors and nurses volunteered to serve in field hospitals through the Red Cross. So when the flu hit, a lot of those medical resources were tied up in the trenches in Europe. As a result, many of those who cared for the sick at home were volunteers. They had varying degrees of experience in medicine, from retired doctors who had returned to service to medical students who were still in training. In some cases, women whose only medical experience was caring for their families ended up caring for entire communities. These volunteers risked and sometimes gave their lives caring for infectious patients. In many cases, their care was the difference between life and death for flu victims. In the United States, Philadelphia had the highest rate of illness and death. Philly really nailed it. City officials knew about the outbreak of the second wave of flu in Boston. They had even issued a bulletin about the dangers of the Spanish flu in early July, but still thought it was no big deal in late September 1918. They didn't even list it as a reportable disease. The tragedy was about to get real. By late September, the public was receiving mixed signals about the flu problem. Assurances were made that the disease was contained to military personnel. Dr. Paul Lewis, director of the Phillips Institute of Philadelphia, announced that they had identified the cause of the flu, incorrectly, of course. Then, on September 28, the city threw a massive parade, of all things, where 200,000 people gathered to support the war effort. Within days, hundreds of new flu cases were being reported. The city was forced to admit it had a problem. Churches, schools and theaters were closed. Unfortunately, around 75% of the city's doctors were unavailable due to the war. Hospitals quickly became overcrowded, requiring churches and state armories to function as shelters for the sick. Dead bodies began to accumulate, constituting a real public health problem. The city appealed to the federal government to send embalmers, and individuals were recruited to dig graves for $15 each. When the epidemic subsided in early November, nearly 13,000 people were dead. Spitting and coughing in public were banned. In some cities, schools, churches and other public places were closed, and additional quarantine measures were also put in place. The medical community knew enough to realize that public gatherings and bodily fluids contributed to the spread of the disease. Aggressive public information campaigns were disseminated similar to the handwashing and "cover your cough" campaigns in circulation today. Perhaps the most hilarious of the public health measures, however, was an ordinance adopted in several places that prohibited spitting. In Newcastle, Pennsylvania, spitting in public resulted in a $1 fine and possible jail time. In all fairness, though, spitting isn't just bad manners. Apparently it actually kills people. The medical community did not understand what caused the flu. The Spanish flu appeared even before the discovery of penicillin and viruses. No viral vaccine even existed, much less one for the flu. The vaccines that did exist were based on bacteria, and at the time, people actually thought that the flu was caused by a bacteria called Bacillus influenza. While they may have helped prevent secondary infections in some cases, they had no hope of stopping viral influenza. It wasn't until 1933 that scientists discovered that the flu was caused by a virus. The first vaccine was developed in 1938, but due to the numerous strains and mutations of influenza viruses constantly adapting, the vaccine remains a haphazard proposition to this day. The flu simply mutates too quickly for a vaccine with broad universality to effectively eradicate it. It's literally the mother of all modern pandemics. Almost all modern strains of the influenza A virus descend in some form from the Spanish flu. The 1918 strain was the H1N1 variety, with its genetic descendants still alive and infectious to this day. Virtually any flu you get is a mutated version of the 1918 H1N1 virus. The 1918 outbreak, however, was much more infectious and virulent than any other strain of H1N1 to date. Part of this was attributed to the lack of immunity to the strain in the human population at the time. The Spanish flu taught a very important lesson at the time that still applies today. That is, at any point, the flu is practically just one or two mutations away from a massive plague of death that humans are powerless to stop. Like all flu viruses, it ended up coming from birds. Ultimately, all human-transmitted influenza originated as avian influenza. Yes, those fluffy, noisy balls of feathers are actually disease-infested harbingers of the apocalypse. Sometimes the virus spreads in some pigs before reaching humans, giving us swine flu. There are two key factors that make an influenza strain reach the pandemic strength of the 1918 strain: infectivity and virulence. For a disease to pose the danger of a pandemic, it actually needs to be easily transmissible from person to person. Although bird flu can sometimes be transferred from birds to humans, or swine flu from pigs to humans, this danger is generally limited to those who work in the food industry. Only after the flu strain develops the ability to be easily transmitted between humans does a true pandemic erupt. The second factor, virulence, is basically how bad the virus is, how likely it is to kill you. A global cold pandemic may be inconvenient, but it's hardly something to stay up at night for. A flu that kills more than 50% of the people infected by it, well, that's another story. These two aspects combined in the Spanish flu in a way that had never been seen before. Certainly, there have been more virulent and infectious pandemics, but no other pandemic has exhibited both of these qualities to such a high degree. For example, the H5N1 virus has had periodic outbreaks in which the mortality rate is greater than 50%. This virus, although virulent, is not very infectious as it has not become easily transmissible from human to human. However, all it takes is a few small mutations. So, what did you think of today's video? Did you already know anything about the Spanish flu? Do you think I could have been avoided? What has changed from the Spanish flu of that time to the pandemics of today? Let us know your thoughts on this topic, as we would love to respond to your comments below. And don't forget to support our channel by subscribing and clicking the bell to receive all notifications. And if you want to enjoy it and learn a little more, be sure to click on one of these videos that we are suggesting for you. Until the next video.